$5 in 1860 bought you half an ounce of paper carried from a levee in Missouri to a wharf in California, and it got there in 10 days. That was the fastest thing in America. It was also, from the first week to the last, a service that lost money on every single letter it agreed to carry, and the men running it knew it. This is the Pony Express told as a set of accounts. What it charged, what it cost to keep on the road, who was actually paying for it, and why the firm that built it was broke inside 2 years. None of that is a debunking. The writers were real, the times were real, and the thing did what it said it would do. It simply never had a customer who could pay for it. Start with the firm that put the horses on the road, because it was not a startup, and the partners were not adventurers looking for a stunt to pull. Russell, Majors, and Waddell were the largest freighting contractors on the plains. In a good year, they had thousands of wagons on the trails, tens of thousands of oxen, and several thousand men on the payroll. Their business was Army supply. When the War Department needed flour and ammunition moved to a fort in Utah, it was this firm that put it in a wagon and took the risk of getting it there. Alexander Majors was the partner who ran the wagons and the men. He had started out with one team and one contract, and he built the operating side of the firm out of nothing but repetition. He was also unusually strict about conduct, and he enforced it in a way that no other freighting outfit on the frontier bothered with, because he thought it made his men worth more. Every man who signed on took an oath that Majors printed and handed over with a Bible. Under no circumstances will I use profane language, and I will drink no intoxicating liquors. That oath is not a legend. It survives in his own memoir, written in old age, and it tells you what kind of operation the freighting business was underneath the romance of it. William Hepburn Russell was the partner who did the promising. He worked Washington, he worked the newspapers, and he made commitments that the operating side then had to turn into something real. William Waddell kept the books and worried about them. Between the three of them, the firm had capital, credit, animals, wagon yards, and a standing relationship with the War Department. The whole scheme rested on a contract that did not exist. There was no Pony Express business plan. There was a bid for something the United States Congress had not yet put out to tender. The Southern route already had a contract worth $600,000 a year. It carried the mail through Texas and Arizona in a long southern loop, and it took most of a month each way. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. They knew that every letter lost money, and they ran it anyway to win a contract nobody had offered them. Was that a business or an advertisement they could not afford? The Southern contract existed for a political reason. The Postmaster General who awarded it was a Tennessean, and the route he chose kept the nation's mail inside the slave states for most of its journey. Russell's argument was that a central route across Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada was far shorter, and that the only real objection to it was the belief that snow closed it every winter. Nobody had proved that either way, because nobody had tried to run it in January. If he could show that the middle of the continent stayed open, the contract would have to move north. That was the whole product, not a delivery service. A demonstration aimed at about a dozen men in Washington, paid for by a private firm out of its own working capital. A demonstration has to be spectacular, or it is worth nothing at all. So they built the thing at a speed that is genuinely hard to credit even at this distance. The route ran 1,966 miles, from St. Joseph in Missouri to Sacramento in California, over 2 mountain ranges and the entire width of the Great Basin. They built or took over about 184 stations along it. A rider changed horses every 10 or 15 miles and handed the mail to the next man after roughly 75. That meant buying 400 or 500 horses, chosen for speed rather than for hauling, which is a different and more expensive animal than the ones the firm already owned. It meant staffing every one of those stations with a keeper and a stock tender who lived there permanently, in country where the nearest settlement might be 2 days away. Around 80 riders carried the mail. Around 400 other men kept the stations running. Almost all of it was assembled inside 2 months, over ground that had no towns on it. The mail itself traveled in a mochila, a leather cover thrown over the saddle with 4 locked pockets at the corners. Changing horses meant lifting it off one animal and dropping it on the next. On the 3rd of April, 1860, riders left St. Joseph and Sacramento in the same hour, heading straight at each other. The advertised time was 10 days from end to end. They made it. The eastbound run came in ahead of schedule and the westbound was close behind, and every newspaper in the country printed the times. As a demonstration, it could not have gone better. Now do the arithmetic the partners were doing, because they were certainly doing it, and there is no version of that arithmetic that comes out in their favor. The charge was $5 for half an ounce. Letters were written on tissue paper to hold the weight down, and even then the mochila carried a few hundred pieces at the absolute limit. $5 was more than a week's wages for a working man in 1860. It was a price that selected its customers, and it selected them down to almost nobody. A bank with a draft to protect would pay it. A newspaper with a story worth a week would pay it. A government office would pay it. A family with very bad news would pay it once. So the load was never full. A typical run carried dozens of letters rather than hundreds, and the price that kept the weight down was the same price that kept the volume down. Against that, the standing cost never moved at all. Riders were paid something in the order of $100 a month, which was extraordinary money, for a job that asked something extraordinary. 400 station men had to be fed and paid in places where the flour and the hay had to be freighted in by wagon, at freight rates, before anybody could eat anything. 400 or 500 horses had to be fed whether or not there was a letter on the road that week. A horse standing idle at a relay station costs exactly what a working one costs. And the route was not quiet. In the spring of 1860, the Paiute War closed whole sections of Nevada. Stations were burned, stock was driven off, and the firm rebuilt at its own expense. Across the whole life of the service, it carried about 35,000 letters. At $5 a time, falling later, that is a total revenue in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars. The running cost over the same period was several times that figure. No amount of selling closed the gap, because the letters that would have closed it did not exist at any price. They cut the rate anyway. $5 became $2.50, and then $1 for half an ounce, which was as low as the service ever went before it ended. The volume did not come. Cutting the price of a luxury does not manufacture a mass market when the mass market has nothing that urgently needs to be 2,000 miles away by Thursday. What did use it was traffic that genuinely could not wait, market prices from the East, government dispatches, election results. The kind of information that is worth money for about a week. In March of 1861, the line carried Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address west in 7 days and 17 hours, which was the fastest crossing it ever made in either direction. For a state that had spent a decade being argued over as a possible republic of its own, having the new president's actual words in a Sacramento paper within the week was not a small thing. That is the strongest case for the Pony Express as something other than a failed business. It tied a coastline to a capital at the exact moment the country was coming apart at the seams. It is a real case, and it is the one usually made. It is also worth noticing that it is an argument about national benefit, not about the accounts, and the accounts were what killed the firm. By the winter of 1860, Russell was out of money. The firm was carrying enormous debt. Its acceptances were falling due in New York, and there was nothing behind most of them. Goddard Bailey was a clerk in the Interior Department, with custody of a trust fund held in government bonds on behalf of several Indian tribes. He was also related to Russell by marriage. Bailey took bonds out of that fund and handed them to Russell, accepting Russell's own paper in exchange, on the understanding that the bonds would be back before anyone counted them. They were not back. The bonds came to about $870,000, and when the shortfall was discovered that December, Bailey confessed and Russell was arrested in New York. A committee of the House of Representatives took evidence through the winter. Russell testified to it, and that testimony later became the reason the criminal case against him collapsed. He never went to prison. The prosecution failed on the question of whether a man could be tried on evidence he had been compelled to give Congress, and the matter was quietly dropped. His credit did not survive it. A man who needs the federal government to award him a mail contract cannot be the man the federal government has just caught holding its bonds. One thing before we go on. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of American financial history every single day. Here is the part that is almost never told, and it is the part that turns the story from bad luck into something harder. The contract Russell wanted did arrive. It arrived in March of 1861. The Overland Mail Act moved the mail off the southern route and onto the central route, exactly as he had argued it should, at $1 million a year. The war had made the southern loop impossible. He had been right about everything except who would be paid for it. The award went to the Overland Mail Company, his rivals from the Southern Road, with Wells Fargo money behind them. Russell's company was given a subcontract to run the eastern leg, and a clause requiring it to keep a fast pony service going until the telegraph was finished. He had proved the route and been hired to service it. Because the second line was already being built along roughly the same ground, and that one did not need horses, stations, hay, or 80 men willing to ride at night. Congress passed the Pacific Telegraph Act in June of 1860, 6 weeks after the first riders went out. It authorized a payment to whichever company would carry a wire to the Pacific. The subsidy on offer was $40,000 a year. The exact words were a sum not exceeding $40,000 per annum for a period of 10 years, in return for government use of the line. Hiram Sibley ran Western Union, and he had been waiting for precisely this. He took the bid, put construction crews at both ends of the gap, and had them build toward each other. So for its final year, the Pony Express was carrying messages between two shrinking ends of wire. It was being paid, in effect, to fill in a hole that was closing from both sides. Every mile of pole that went up shortened the paying part of the route. The service was not being outcompeted so much as slowly amputated by a project the government was funding while it ran. On the 24th of October, 1861, the crews met in Salt Lake City and the wire was joined. The first message across, it went a Lincoln from the Chief Justice of California. 2 days later, the Pony Express was ordered to close. The last mail came in during November. A service that had taken 2 months to build was ended by a telegram in about 48 hours. Ben Holliday took the assets in 1862 for the debts. He ran the staging business profitably for years and sold it to Wells Fargo, which is the ending the partners did not get. Russell died with almost nothing. Waddell died with almost nothing. Majors ended up in old age writing his memoir with financial help from a former employee who had become extremely famous. That employee was William Cody. The show he built put the Pony Express in front of more people in a single season than the actual service had carried letters in its entire existence. Which is where the famous recruiting advertisement comes from. Young, skinny, wiry fellows, orphans preferred. Every book quotes it, and no one has ever produced the newspaper that printed it. That is the shape of the whole thing. The legend was worth more than the line. A postage stamp, a national trail, a name on hotels and highways, and 100 paintings. None of that value came back to the men who paid for it. You cannot invoice the public for the idea of yourself, and they had no contract in hand to fall back on when the idea was all that was left. Here is the ledger with nothing in it that is disputed by anybody. The service ran for 18 months and then it stopped, having never once held a mail contract in its own name. The loss on the whole venture came to about $200,000. The firm behind it did not survive, and the route it opened was carried by a competitor and then by a wire. The serious defense of Russell is that he was right, and that being early is not the same as being wrong. The mail did move north. The telegraph followed the route. The railroad followed the telegraph. The case against him is that all of it was visible in 1860. The Telegraph Act was public in June. The line of poles was public. He spent other people's money proving a point to a government that was already paying to make the point obsolete. So the answer depends on what you think he was actually selling. A delivery service that never balanced, or a proof of concept for infrastructure that somebody else was always going to own. The writers were paid. The stations were built. The letters arrived, and they arrived faster than anything in America had ever moved. Every single one of them arrived at a loss.